Welcome to r/malicious compliance, where we share stories of people conforming to the letter, but not the spirit of a request. And today we have 3 great stories, so subscribe, hit the like button, and let's begin. The first story. Boss told me I was beating daily targets too much, so I did exact target, then built rubber band ball instead on company time. The second story. The manager told me, I pay you, I decide what you will do with your time. The third story. All entries must be submitted to senior management and approved prior to submission. Today's first story is work half day, paid for full. So this happened a few years ago when I was on an apprenticeship at an office job. I'd been working there about 3 months when the story begins. The job I was doing was essentially an admin role. I'd do address and phone number changes on client profiles, send out letters, requesting information and sorting out posts that came back. This was all done through the database where I'd get my to-dos from. After a few weeks training, I was picking it up quite quickly. I'm reasonably good with computers, and it was a fairly simple system. I made an Excel with a few macros, and I was flying through the work. At my 3-month review with manager, she pulled up my stats, and I was more than clearing my daily target to-dos. In fact, I was clearing double. Expecting her to say well done, I was surprised when she instead questioned if I was doing the work correctly. She was concerned that I might have been rushing and making mistakes. Although at this stage of the apprenticeship, 10% of my work was being checked by the quality team, and I'd pass all my checks, which was on the same report she had in her hand. So she set a goal for reducing my amount cleared more in line with the target by next month. So I decided to scrap the macros and do it all the slow way for a month, double checking everything. It was draining because I was continually focusing on how many I had done that day, and making some last longer just to pad out my day, and so I would look like I was working. End of the month comes and I have the follow-up meeting. I'm down to about 20% over my daily target, so it's obvious I've taken on board what was said and made changes. My quality score is still perfect. Instead of recognizing what I did to try and comply, my manager tells me off about still being over the target and suggests I'm still rushing my work. She scheduled another meeting about a month later and that was the end. By the way, both the meetings were documented, and I was sent copies of what I had agreed to. Well, here comes the compliance. I started using the macros again and would complete my target in about half my working day, then stop doing any more. I had to stay in the office for a full day to clock out on time, but I wouldn't do any more to-dos. Now the office had about 150 to 200 staff on site and a few teams, but the room I was in was about 20 people doing the same job as me, and managers rarely came in. After the first day of just sitting on my phone, I decided I needed a project. I found 2 large bags of rubber bands in the stationery room and had a great idea, so I built a rubber band ball from scratch. Fast forward about 2 weeks of me doing work in the mornings and band ball building in the afternoons, to when the site manager, 2 levels above my manager, was giving someone from head office a tour. Yes, in the afternoon. Nothing was said, but I knew he wasn't happy by the fact he kept looking over at me while the visitor was talking to other people. Inevitably, next morning he's invited me to a meeting with him and the floor manager, the level above my manager, so I take my notes and go see him. After proving that I had been meeting my target and showing that I had been told not to go over the target, I was sent back to work. Don't know what happened after that, but about an hour later I had an email from my manager telling me to disregard the target and complete as much as I'm able to. She also canceled our meeting. A week or so after that, I was transferred to the team that implemented new processes and had lots of fun completing the apprenticeship by writing and sharing the macros that originally started it all. By the way, rubber band ball is proudly on shelf at home, 20 centimeters diameter. Edit. To answer some comments. For those saying I shouldn't give 100% because of burnout, losing a job, etc., this was my first office job, so I wasn't aware of the standard tactics to make the day last, but I wasn't even at 100%. The main reason the target was so low was just lack of computer experience. I was the youngest there when I started, early 20s. Before me, the baby of the team was late 40s, and they all had been there 15 plus years. The month I took things slow, it was honestly hard to not hit the target every day. The core was just 2 rubber bands knotted a bunch of times, then just kept wrapping it up. It started out really weirdly shaped, but as it got bigger, it smoothed out onto a ball. I stayed there 18 months for the qualification that came with the apprenticeship, then used it to get a better job elsewhere. Before I left, I did help change the policy from daily targets per person to weekly expectations per section, so good and bad days, and skilled and novice workers balanced out. Yes, there are companies that treat employees like crap. Don't work for them. They're bad companies. People who are good at their jobs don't need to take that crap in today's environment. Decent people are hard to find. But on the other hand, if you work for a good company and you have a good contract, You can never work your best. If you're in a union, you should never work more than 70% of your full potential. If you do, not only will everyone expect the best from you, but you will set expectations for everyone else in your work environment. If you can make a macro that makes your work twice as fast, you better keep quiet about it. The vast majority of jobs will reward you for it by giving you more work without more money. If they want a task done by 3 p.m. and you can get it done by 1 p.m., either stall it or find a way to kill time before you let them know it's done. I know it's okay to want to give 100% in everything you do, but in jobs that give 100%, you create a pedestal that everyone wants to avoid. The next story is, don't want me to make anything? Alrighty. I used to work for a certain aerospace manufacturer. The plant I was in made wire bundles. They were basically how the computer in the plane communicated with the rest of the plane. Our site had been experiencing slow output for a long time. On the books, we were a year behind schedule. Everyone could go from working 40-hour to 80 shifts for 12 months, and we would maybe catch up. Management was constantly getting chewed out by customers. We were constantly getting chewed out by management. It was a pretty awful place to work. Because we were so far behind, management's bright idea was to hire a whole bunch of new guys. Just throw more people at the problem. Great, only one problem. At our site, we quality checked our output ourselves. There were a few steps where quality assurance was called in just to double check. For the most part though, we had to make and check our bundles ourselves. However, you had to be working a pretty long time to earn this right. We're talking 6 months at the fastest. Until then, you were assigned a mentor to check your work, and maybe even teach you. This worked fine when the mentor-mentee ratio was 1-to-1. Thanks to the hiring spree, however, mentors were absolutely flooded. I had 5 people assigned to me at one point. This meant that the people who could make wire bundles the fastest couldn't. They spent all their time checking other people's work instead. It gets worse though. New guys were of course slow and made mistakes. If a mentor doesn't catch it, the mentor's quality gets dinged, not the new guy. Once mentors started getting flooded, a lot more mistakes were let through. This meant that basically the entire line was in danger of losing their own quality checking status. We were absolutely peeved. My manager was pretty green, as this was his first time in such a position. He was one of those guys who thought now that he wasn't on the bottom rung he was superior. He called a meeting about how our quality was down. His new idea was to give mentors more time to check bundles, and just waive them actually making harnesses. I pointed out that most of the actual production on the floor came from us, the experienced techs. If we didn't work on the actual harnesses, there's no way we'd gain our schedule. My manager looked straight at me. I pay you, I decide what you do with your time. That was that. If he wanted me to spend all my time checking, I would spend all my time checking. Cue malicious compliance. Where I used to spend about 50% of the day checking, I now spent 90%. I would ding my mentees for the smallest mistakes. Connector has a tiny scratch, scrap the harness. Wire is bent a little funny, scrap the harness. Label has a small smudge on it, scrap the harness. Each time that probably costs over $20 in materials and a couple of labor hours, multiple times a day. I became the prettiest, most micromanaging inspector imaginable. All technically against spec, and thus correct choices to make. After a week, other mentors caught on too. We kept it up for a month straight. Our production was half of what it used to be. Sometimes I could see the manager in the office crying after a customer call. Manager called a meeting after that in a big huff. After talking it over with quality assurance, they had reached a decision where most mistakes would land on the mentee, not the mentor. He looked absolutely crushed. Things went back to how they were before. With us now a year and 2 weeks behind schedule basically, I stopped working there a while after. From what I hear, it's still absolute hell though. I work in a warehouse, and my job is woefully understaffed with ATM. And what do you think they do? Hire hundreds of new employees who need to be individually trained to use different types of power equipment, and then run orders on the power equipment. The training takes at least 2 weeks to get them to the proper level of efficiency, to operate the equipment, and another week or so to teach them how to collect orders correctly, while teaching them safety rules and regulations so they don't hurt themselves or others. The peak season is only 3 months, so we slow down with all these new employees during the busiest season, which leads to a later finish time for everyone, which requires a lot of overtime and forces more people to walk. So they're throwing more people at the problem, and the cycle continues. Haha. The last story is little to no regret. So I was recently, about 6 months ago, hired by a big company to do it. During one of the training sessions, we were told to do 10 to 25 tickets a day. The tickets took a maximum of 3 minutes to answer if it was an easy case, as most of us had replied written up that we used over and over again. So one day I did 31. Another day when I was being lazy, I still did 27. Boss's supervisor was thrilled at me. One of my higher-ups was not. I was clearly making her look bad because, like I said, minimum per day was 10, and she's a skater. So she decided to spend all the free time she clearly had combing through my replies to tickets with a fine-tooth comb, tearing apart every word and reply as much as she could. 2 days after I was told my work was great, I was informed that all work had to be submitted to a higher-up and approved before being sent in. I was like, WTF? 2 days ago you said all was well. But I just smiled, said no problem, and then was handed a printed out Excel spreadsheet by peeved lazy higher-up detailing her shredding work. 3 minutes into reading, I decided to go hunting. None of her responses were bad. All she did was reword things, some of which I didn't even write, as I had used replies that my trainer had been using for years. So I had asked at some point how to know how many tickets I do, and boss's boss had sent me a link into her account, where not only could I see what cases I had done, but everyone's cases. That's when I discovered why lazy higher-up hated me. I was putting her at risk of being fired by running circles around her. So since lazy worker had been there longer, of course she was listened to. After a heated senior staff meeting, boss's boss took all us newbies aside and said we all had to get our work approved by a higher-up before sending it out. Now I had shared a lot of my shortcuts with my coworkers, so we were all doing more work than our superiors got done. That must mean we're badly trained, right? Well, let me tell you the stupidity of that instruction. You see, I worked Tier 1, so anything I didn't know, I was already asking people about, as were my coworkers down on Tier 1. But by not letting us submit anything at all, work came to a more or less standstill, with our higher-ups run ragged going back and forth, proofreading all our tickets before we could send them. This meant that they couldn't get any of their own work done until after all us temps left for the day, which meant our already painfully slow ticket response time was 10 times slower, with us noobs only able to submit 5 to 10 a day, instead of the 20 to 30 we were doing just a day before the new absurd mandate, and the upper levels had no time to do tickets of their own, after having to approve all of ours all day every day. It's really hard to explain how pleasing it was to watch lazy higher-up running around, because of course we all asked her for a feedback, since she clearly didn't agree with her fellow upper-tier people's emails that we had to work with. So she and she alone could truly tell us how to word things, right? After all, I had a printed Excel sheet, page after page after page of her tearing apart the replies her coworkers at her level had been using, and all our jobs were on the line over this, as we needed to show immediate improvement. This lasted a whopping 3 days before we were all fired. That's right, fired, because if the managers had to read and approve our responses, clearly we were not cut out for the job. You told us to get them approved, remember? But honestly, I don't care. It was the most entertaining 3 days I ever spent in tech support. I do feel a little bad for lazy workers' coworkers, who were also worked to the bone doing our jobs, as well as theirs, but since none of them spoke in our defense, clearly, my sympathy for their plight is limited. I've worked so many times with bums who are only interested in protecting their power base. The cold reality of professional work is to work hard enough to keep your job, but not hard enough to disrupt the status quo. I could never find the right balance. In my country, you could sue them for wrongful termination, because it was their fault. Subscribe, hit the like button, and have a nice day.